want to welcome you to the forum at All Saints Church. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church. Usually we're down a level below this. We've got some repairs going on our elevator, which was just one step above the technology with people pulling it with ropes. And that is going to be changing really soon, so we should be back to normal in the next couple weeks. Thank you all for finding your way here. At all times, we put our faith into action. Here at All Saints Church, every week we pick one thing to focus our action as a community. This week is the 74th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so our action table is signing a letter to your representatives in Congress, asking them to have this country move away from nuclear power and move away from fossil fuels and move towards having this country have its dependence on energy be on renewable energy sources. And so this is incredibly important. It's things like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been talking about in terms of a Green New Deal, and we need to get behind this. So please make your way to the action table before you leave if you haven't already, and sign that letter. Next week, I want to invite you to keep on coming back. We have the Reverend Eddie Anderson. Eddie is the pastor at McCarty Memorial United Methodist Church in downtown Los Angeles. He is also the co-leader of the Poor People's Campaign in the state of California. Many of you know Bishop William Barber, who has gathered faith leaders from all over the country in resurrecting Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which he was working on when he was martyred. And Eddie is going to be here. He's going to preach at our services, and he's going to talk about in this forum how we can be involved as a congregation and individuals in this faith movement throughout this country. So please come back next Sunday for that. Will you pray with me, please? Most holy and loving God, giver of all good gifts, we ask you to be present in this space. We ask you to convict us above all that each of us is made in your image and that we are loved beyond measure. And out of realizing and trusting in that love for ourselves, we may love one another as you love us. Help us learn more and more from each other what that love looks like lived out loud. Help us learn what it looks like in here. Help us learn what it looks like out in the streets. Help us learn what it looks like in ways that give us courage to change that which needs to be changed. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So welcome, everybody, and I want to welcome, we got folks coming in from the 9 o'clock service. Find a seat, and I hope we have enough chairs here. It really is an honor to welcome the Reverend, and you weren't doctor the last time we met, so it's now the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. I think you and I met for the first time when you were, I think Rebecca Ragland got us together, when you all were students at Eden together. And when Michael Brown was murdered by Darren Wilson, there were a couple people that I really looked to show me what it meant to be a person of faith and a leader of faith. And it was people like Reverend Tracy Blackman and you, who in turn pointed me to the young people. And so we're about 5 years later from that, and it is an honor to have you here. And so can we first start off by welcoming Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, and I want to spend most of our time talking about today and going forward, and I also think it's important to spend a little time looking back. And so can you talk about 5 years ago and what happened in the uprising in Ferguson and maybe why it happened and also what you learned from the experience?
Yeah. No, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you to all of you for creating space for this conversation. What happened is we had another episode in our country's lack of care for our children. An 18-year-old was cut down by the state, and in the interest of the images of family separation, his mother was kept from his body by yellow police tape as she wept and reached for him. And young people who approximated his age, his education, and his position decided to go outside and keep raising hell until everybody else paid attention. And people would not have paid as much attention were it not, quite frankly, for a couple of folks from Southern California and from New Jersey who decided from coast to coast that they were going to come in at the response, in the invitation, and to amplify the voices of young activists on the ground and take that message back all across the nation. So before the end of August. So you think about how long it takes church folk to organize anything. August 9th, he's lying on the ground. That night really begins the first seeds of the uprising. By August 31st, there were already from US and Canada young people who gathered, amplify voices, young people, journalists, let me be very clear about that so you don't think it's just a bunch of people, right? Journalists, activists, organizers, healers, attorneys. Specific calls were made for these groups to come from all across the country to come and witness, give voice, and to amplify what was going on. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we would have been able to sustain voices and movement in the streets for over a year. I'm not sure that people would have paid that much attention. You understand, we're separating that many families every few milliseconds, right? We understand that we don't care about mothers crying right now. And so I believe more than anything else, and part of what I've learned is that it takes the call and commitments, the standing together and the witness of people who care a little bit, putting bodies in place, sharing the best of their resources, including their intellectual capacities and their very spirits and souls, to make America pay attention to anything. And I think that's the most critical lesson.
So you talk today, and if you haven't heard the sermon, please come to 11:15 and hear Starsky Priest. But you talk about the power of place, and you talk about the particularities. And this certainly was not the last time that a young black man had been killed by the state, and it's happened plenty of times since. What was different? What was different about the alchemy of Ferguson that caused something to happen there that had not happened in that way before?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the pieces, right? So a couple of pieces, right, that are really kind of simple to see, right? There's the social media. Most people are not like me, right? Seeing Michael Brown lying in the middle of his own blood was not the first time for me. I had a brother who was murdered. I sat through the trial. The first image I saw like that in real life with that proximity was my own brother. For me, when I saw Mike, though, it reconnected to that reality from when I was a young person and called me in a different kind of way. But I do think others seeing that image was critical. The other is this calling together of people from across the country. I think that was critical, right? So the fact that people kind of converged upon the community and carried a message back very intentionally, right? So when Akiba Solomon is there from Color Lines and it's organizing people, I saw the breakout. So we hosted, that's where I met Jasmine, we hosted over those 4 days on that Labor Day weekend, the Freedom Riders who had been displaced by a local university who first said yes and then said no. I don't think that's quite gonna work for us. A little bit too political. When they decided to put these pieces together, they were very intentional about where message needed to be carried, right? So Akiba Solomon from Color Lines being there is critical and important. Brittany Cooper being there from Rutgers to both do education in the teach-ins, but also to reflect from a black feminist perspective back out to community what was going on through her thought leadership platforms. Jamila Lemieux from Ebony. So the very intentional gathering of voice, intentionality about carrying narrative was critical there. And I think the witness and the commitment of folks who just recognized that America didn't have anything else to give them that it was going to really give them. So they may as well put all they had into this. And so I talk a lot about, being able to, image around Michael Brown's body, seeing Rasheed Aldridge, a young person in our community who was, working at a place. I don't know if they have this place here. There's these places that make sandwiches freaky fast. Do they have those here? They don't have those here? And so that's their thing. They make sandwiches freaky fast. So he's working at a fast food place. He's working at a fast food place, organizing for $15 minimum wage and a union, right? He looks down and sees Michael Brown, looks over and sees Brittany Farrell. Brittany Farrell was a Deaconess nursing scholar, right? She was doing all of the stuff we tell young people to do. She had a young child, but she was also engaging fully in school. She was a leader in the Student Nursing Association for the country and was getting great grades, such that she was getting scholarships and engaged. Grew up in Ferguson. She sees, quite frankly, what Rasheed sees what Tori sees. They all see that they're the first generations of Americans who will not do as well as their parents, right? Fact. We now have the second generation, Generation Z, that will not do as well as their parents. So all of the narrative about the myth of progress through rugged individualism, deferred gratification, and education absolutely had broken down. Because this could be them as well as it was anybody else. And I think the strength of their capacity to assess and engage that reality, to map powers in that way, and to critically assess the issue, said, look, no need in playing this other game. Put all we got into this, and let's see what happens. And people began to pay attention. So I began to talk to, my well-respected and respectable clergy who came in around the country, particularly black church leaders, who would say, well, I looked at the voter turnout from last Ferguson election, and I see people don't vote. Are they registering voters? And I would say, man, don't talk to them about voting and voter registration when it was going out in the streets that made you even pay attention to them in the first place. Where were you? You weren't listening to them when they were, when it was voter registration time. You weren't listening to them when it was education time. You were trying to get money from the Democrats who gave GOTV dollars and street money to your congregation. So don't talk to them about voting. You get out here in the streets with them and then see what they want to talk about, right? And so the whole rejection of these systems to provide an alternative witness, to engage in another reality and a vision they got a glimpse of before we even got a clue, was what was different about this moment.
Yeah, and so then the governor calls you up and asks you to be on the Ferguson Commission. I remember we had a conversation, and one of the things you talked about is when these structures of power want to co-opt you, they give you awards, and they put you on commissions because they hope it'll shut you up because you'll care more about that stuff than speaking the truth. So before we talk about the commission's work, just talk a little bit about what was it like? What did you have to go through to decide to actually say yes to that?
Tara T. So Tara Thompson, another activist of the movement. I try to bring folks into these rooms, right? So everybody can't afford airfare to bring everybody. So bring folks in the room. Tara, I knew from college at Xavier University. She's my wife's sorority sister. And Tara would say to me every now and then, she said, "Oh man, we praying for you because they trying to take your soul." She said, "They're trying to take your soul." So. We see you on TV, you with the governor and with like all the business leaders, like, ooh, Lord, we're gonna lift you up.
That's right.
Because it was a real dance. What the governor knew was quite frankly that we were in a post-Occupy, shut down era of protest and organizing. So what they knew was you can have a commission and at the first meeting it's getting shut down. Like people would not allow it to work unless there were people of and from the community. So backstory real quick, by the time the Freedom Ride happened, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the daily newspaper, had called for a commission and they called for the president to put together a commission and he wasn't gonna touch it. Then they started calling, by the time they made it September, they were calling for the governor to put together. He wasn't gonna touch it. The first contact I got about a commission was that the St. Louis County executive and the mayor were gonna jointly put together a commission, and then they asked me whether I would do it. I was like, nah. No. I was like, nah. Took me out to lunch, real expensive spot. The deputy mayor, well, we really need to put this together. Y'all might need to put that together.
That's right.
But I'm gonna need to live in this town after y'all done. So I'm gonna say, no, thank you.
That's right.
Respectfully, right? And so So part of what happens after a while is they recognize, the governor recognizes that he needs to do something. He's actually getting pressure from D.C. To do something while they're figuring out what they're going to do as well, because everybody thinks in 6 weeks this is going to be over. No. But like week 8, people are like, oh, hell, they're not going inside.
That's right. That's right.
So part of what happens, and this was actually reported in St. Louis, there is kind of a backdoor meeting between the governor and the mayor. And I say the back door because the reports literally in the story in the daily newspaper is that the governor is seen leaving like the side door of City Hall, right? And they kind of hand over to him all the stuff that they had gathered. They had names of people, they had done some initial vetting, all that kind of stuff to help him prep for this thing that he was going to do. By this point, he had done these couple of things to try to get people to calm down. One of the things he did to try to get people to calm down was he found a black man to appoint to be the director of public safety. His name was Dr. Dan Isom. He had been the chief of police in St. Louis, had a PhD in criminology. He was overqualified for every job in the state. And so this is how black people get jobs that are beneath them. They overqualify. And then in order to calm people down, he appointed Chief Isom. Well, Chief Isom and I worked together on a youth violence prevention plan. We had pulled together from St. Louis City, East St. Louis, and St. Louis County a plan with some other philanthropists and organizers to reduce youth and gun violence. And so he's whispering to the governor's ear. He's like, look, you might want to check for Starsky. And so the governor gives me a call. I go into a meeting. He says nothing about, he's just asking questions about how this may need to go and all this. So he's interviewing me without saying that he's interviewing me because he didn't want to be committed. And I just kind of, holler at him. And so he decides that I'm the person, or somebody decides for him that I'm the person. And then I start negotiating with the street about whether I can do it.
Right.
And so we pulled together a meeting at the parsonage of St. John's. Me and Tracy Blackman, aforementioned, she's been in this space before. She said, y'all real nice people, by the way. She did. She said it on Facebook. You can find it. Just the other day, I said I was coming. She said, oh, they're great people, great church. So, y'all got good press. And so me and Tracy are pulling people together. We're like, so we call Montega Simmons from the Organization for Black Struggle. We call Brittany Farrell and Alexis Templeton from Millennial Activists United. And we meet at the parsonage of St. John's to let them know what's going on as far as these conversations, because the governor's now made this call, 300 people apply, but then they made direct outreach to some people to ask about doing this process, and we don't want to get co-opted ourselves, so we want to talk to them about it. We found out that Brittany Pagnett, at the same time, Sunday afternoon, is in the same conversation with Tori Russell. So we're like, oh, we know what y'all talking about. Come over here. Right. And so Brittany, Tracy, and I have a meeting behind closed doors at the parsonage of the church to ask the activists whether we could do it. Right. To get their permission to move forward. Which famously, Alexis Templeton says, and we had to ask for interpretation, oh, you no money with me. I say that slow, I talk fast. You are new money with me. Yeah. I was like, okay, what that mean? Yeah. She's like, who don't like money and ain't it better when it's new? Yeah. Right? You good. Yeah. You got our blessing. You can do what you need to do. And what are the commitments we make at the same time, activists, because the state was organizing with them and negotiating, they were determining who they wanted to put on the commission. They thought they would get one voice. That's what the state offered them, but the reality is they needed somebody who was kind of, they called me a middler. They needed a middler like me. They needed a faith leader. Anytime politicians want to do something and they want black people, they think they need a preacher. And so so Tracy was the preacher, I was the middler, Brittany was the education reformist who had been working with a lot of these powers for a long time. And then from the movement, really, they understood to be Rasheen Aldridge. And so what we committed to was, if it looked like this was going the way that commissions go, then we wouldn't just leave, but we would all leave together, thus delegitimizing the whole process and showing it for what it is. And then we studied really closely what commissions are and how they work or how they don't work. I studied very deeply because I'm a nerd. I studied this book by a woman by the name of Dr. Lindsay Lupo, also a Californian. And she wrote a book called Flack Catchers, 100 Years of Riot Commission Politics in America. That made me very comforted when I read the title, Flack Catcher. Like, that's what I signed it up for. And she talked about how commissions work, how they don't work, and we were very intentional to look out and watch out for those signs.
Yeah. So, and that's perfect, because y'all do some amazing work, and the report's online. It's called Forward Through Ferguson. And it is some of the best commission work that I can see. And I want to read something from the top sheet, and it actually has some lupo in it. It says, historically, these commissions are appointed to calm the public and give the impression that the government is doing something, but are little more than a tool to maintain the status quo. Past commissions focused on economic revitalization to the exclusion of social issues such as racial tension, segregation, and discrimination. It is as though the commissions are arguing that our society has moved beyond race. Thus, the problems must be purely economic, but race remains at the root of the violence. However, it's important to understand that racial inequity in our region is not the same as individual racism. We are not pointing fingers and calling individual people racist. We're not even suggesting that institutions or existing systems intend to be racist. What we are pointing out is that the data suggests time and again that our institutions and existing systems are not equal, and that this has racial repercussions. Black people in the region feel those repercussions when it comes to law enforcement, the justice system, housing, health, education, and income. The law says all citizens are equal, but the data says not everyone is treated that way.
Just for the record,
Yeah.
that was published in September 2015. If it was published post-November 2016, I would have started pointing some fingers at some people who are individually racist.
Well, that's part of where I want to go with
and
this.
I wouldn't have to look very far.
Right, that's part of where I want to go with
To the
this.
east, my brother, to the east.
So, well, let me go with that one first then. So, we're hearing a lot of racist things from our president and other politicians and their supporters, and that's taken up a lot of bandwidth. Conversations about racial equity are not.
Right.
So first of all, what is the difference between, you draw a distinction of the commissions between racism and racial inequity. Yeah. Can you unpack that some?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I mean, I'll talk about racial equity, right? So, and I like to distinguish it more than anything else from equality, right? We've evolved our conversation. We had a great conversation in the 1960s. There are institutions that advanced through the 1980s, this concept of equal access to opportunity, which means everybody gets a fair shot, right? Now, of course, the reality with that is when you begin behind, this was former, I can't call his name right now, former president of Morehouse College. When you begin behind in the race of life, you must either be intent to stay behind or run faster than the man in front. That was a call really to young black educated men that if they really wanted to match up with everybody else, no matter when no matter when the opening gun was shot for the race, they actually had to do more. Mm-hmm. Racial equity suggests that if we really want to get to common outcomes among people in differing people groups, then we have to do more for the people who began behind in order to get to what we would call a situation of equity or equality on the other side, right? So equality says everybody gets a fair shot. Equity says no, those people who have historically and systematically been held behind need additional supports in order to meet our common standards, right? When we talk about racism, we're talking about an ethos that comes forth from a commitment to a hierarchy of human values. And here in the West, that has much to do with the acceptance and the assent to the concepts of white supremacy. We believe that white people are better than all other people, right? Mm-hmm. So when we start talking about who can and who can't come into our country, if you're from a white country, you good. Yep. If you're from a country where people are twice kissed by God's son, people of the global majority who are people of color, then it's somehow an S country. Yep. That's just white supremacist thinking, right? And we see it played out in the context of policy. And when we see that kind of thinking played out in policy, now we're beginning to see how inequities get burned into systems and institutions. But it begins with the thinking, right? So what are the patterns of thinking that begin to get us this place? And a lot of it has to do with, things like feeling really good, nostalgic feelings about certain concepts rooted in European thought. Kelly Brown Douglas does a remarkable job in Stand Your Ground of talking about our romanticization of Germanic tribes that then make us think about how democracy should work based upon notions of tribes and images and stories that quite frankly never were. But they're white stories. But they inform how we talk about democracy. And so we think about democracy in America as tied to a myth of Germanic tribes in Europe, and so guess what that means? That actually reinforces that white people should probably be in charge of democracy. right? Because they're the people who know what it's like. It's kind of in the being and generation by generation in white people to do democracy. So what do we do when we set up democratic forums in America and set up institutions of government? What do we set it up after? White people, particularly white churches, Episcopal polity.
That's right. That's right.
Right?
Yep.
Embedded
Yep.
in systems of how we understand ourselves to be community, right?
So this is work of not just changing and dismantling and systems, it is work of changing core narratives.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and that's not work that happens overnight.
No.
It is slow work. So a couple things about that, which is a couple questions. First is, so we have racist rhetoric that has always been there, but it is on the rise. It is getting greater and greater bandwidth. And yet we also know that we have to do this work of changing the narrative and changing institutional structures. Can you talk about the balance of where do we spend our energy calling out so many instances of individual and corporate racism?
Yeah.
And also, where do we spend our energy trying to shift the narrative, trying to actually change the systems? Because it feels to me like we can be swinging at every pitch that comes by because there's so much of it out there, and then we're letting that deplete all our energy and not doing the other work.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, deep discernment and reflection about what your sense of call and what your gifts are. Yeah. Your gifts as an individual, your gifts as an institution, your gifts as a community. Like, what are we called to do is a critical assessment. And then how are we called to do it becomes the next question as we talk about kind of mapping powers and systems in our respective areas. Now, I do believe what we underinvest in is the reality and power of narratives. Yeah. And some of this has to do with the investiture of authority of people with capacity to change narratives, preachers, right? As an example. Yeah. So who do we center? Who do we appreciate? Who do we honor with the capacity that we have to speak, right? So I'm really appreciative, me and Mike were talking, that later this year you all are gonna play host to Dr. Will Gaffney, right? Who is just doing this. Black woman, only a black woman would decide, first analyze that the lectionary itself that guides all of our church tradition, the way we choose scriptures and the way we interpret them, is both patriarchal and racist. And then do something about it. Like, the brothers will say it.
That's right.
Right? But she's committed to crafting a women's lectionary where she's doing all of her own translation. Y'all, I thought there's people here who so real Bible study requires, let's talk about narratives. Taking the text that has been given to us, canonized through a political process, translated from language to language, so we are 4 or 5 languages away from the original conversation and context. Reading back through that 4 or 5 layers and then putting it in context. And she's taking 4 scriptures for every Sunday in a cycle of 3 years and redoing all of it. That's narrative change work, right? And in order for us, but she is, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, situated at an institution that gives her space and room, living a life such that she can commit herself deeply to that work, and having good friends like the ones at All Saints who are willing to support her in sabbatical for a period so she can be a scholar in residence to do that work. That's an effective use of your skill set, heart set, and gifts from God, the charisms that God has given you to change the narrative. And I believe that we are all so situated with gifts to do that kind of subversive work. The question is, are we spending enough time in reflection, in community, in discernment, in prayer, in conversation to hear what it is God wants us to do? Hers is around narrative, but I hear y'all, I gotta meet, who's the sister who's here who once a month goes and puts her body at
Christine
16?
Hartman. Christine Hartman.
I gotta meet Christine.
Are you in the room, Christine? She,
I gotta meet Christine.
Yeah, she goes.
She deserves.
It's called Meet Up, Speak Out. She goes. She's incredible. Once a month goes and stands in front of the White House.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we talk about policy change, it may be that you've got the resource of time that Christine has to be a witness. I have to analyze all the legislation, all the policy, right? Yeah. But you can be a witness and put your body in space based upon your contextualized understanding of your resources. And so we've all got something. The question is, how can we engage deeply in reflection about vocation and call so we can figure out what our something is to do? And there are enough of us. Y'all do understand we're the majority in America, right? Check out this book by a brother by the name of Stephen Phillips called Brown is the New White. Mm-hmm. He analyzed the voter pattern, the citizen age voting population and the voting patterns from the 2 Obama elections, and assessed that progressive whites and people of color make up the majority of the voting population in America and have now for over a decade, right? So part of what is happening here, right? So we're in the majority. So if we all figure out what we are called to do and do that, there are more with us than there are against us, right? If you want to use that binary thinking, I know that's limited and all that kind of stuff. Right? But I say it to say that I believe that we will win if we all figure out what we're called to do.
That's right. And so thank you. And that's a great call to us as a church. And you know, what I would also lift up is the church is 2 things. It is the institution, it is the community. Yeah. And it is the gathered community. And we believe that God uses us as a community in certain ways, and we have charisms and gifts that we have to discern in that way. And then there's also individual. Yeah. Because individually, the impact of the church becomes exponentially greater if we act both as a community, but also act each as individuals. Yeah. And so for us to be a place where we can continue to have these conversations and say, how is God calling us to be present in these movements of shifting narratives and changing institutional structures for such a time as this? You preach about place today. We're going through this whole process, the PACES process of looking at this place. How is this place called to be a place of transformation in that way? Yeah. So 2 things. First, a commercial. Dr. Will Gaffney, you're talking about, she's going to be here the whole month of November. And she's going to be doing some preaching and teaching and working on this project. We're getting a team together to help with that. If anyone wants to, Brunell Anderson, I'm going to point. Brunell is coordinating the team for Dr. Anderson's coordinating the team for Dr. Gaffney. And then the other thing I'll say is I got through about a third of the stuff I wanted to talk with you about, and that just means you're going to have to come back, right?
Cool.
Okay. Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson.
Thank you.